Okay. Can you all see my screen? Yes. Okay. All right. So today we are going to do source localization. So very quick recap. We looked at the current source density. The process to compute the sources from the voltage distribution, and then this just involves using these two formulae, the getting the electric field as the negative gradient of voltage, and then looking at the divergence of the electric field to get to the sources. Okay, and if you put this together, you have to do what is called the Laplacian operator, which is just the double spatial derivative uh, along the 3 dimensions, and then you add them up. Okay, so it's actually a scalar quantity that comes out. Uh, so yes, so we were setting up the source localization problem, and we did that first using analytic approaches, which is what was done back in the days. And there, even for a very simple concentric model, it was a very complicated solution. Um, Yeah, to solve this, we used the Neumann boundary conditions, which basically is based on the fact that you can't pile up charge at the interface, and no current can be injected into the air outside, and the voltage cannot have discontinuities, because then its gradient is going to be infinite. So based on that, you could actually analytically solve the voltage distribution given a dipole, but it's a very complex, very complex output. So nowadays, the strategy used is different. Most of the times, we use more realistic head models, which are composed of meshes, interconnected meshes for each of the three uh, three tissues that are present: brain, skull, and head. They all have different conductivities. When you're using a mesh, it is still the same conductivity. You don't talk about anisotropy here. And you are essentially just solving these kind of equations repeatedly for each of the interfaces that you get across a particular tissue, as well as within a particular tissue, as well as across different tissues. So that's the boundary element method. You also have a finite element method, which is for where you consider the different tissues as volumes, small volumes, not as surfaces. Okay, so here the math is even more complicated, but you can deal with tissue anisotropy. Okay, so given all of this, this is what we did in the last class. Uh, we essentially represented our voltage at the sensor as a vector, and this is now a product of the dipole sources that you have here, pre-multiplied by a matrix called the gain field matrix, gain matrix or lead field matrix. And this is what we need to essentially have. This matrix is what relates G to V. Okay, so in the last class, this is where we had stopped. Look at the matrix dimensions. This V is a n cross T matrix. T is just the number of time points that you have. So n would be a number like 64 or 128. And P is the number of dipoles, which could be anything. You could have 10,000 dipoles if you want, for example. Okay, and then you have a noise matrix as well, which is given by same size as V. And then the forward problem is trivially solved if you know G, because then you just multiply your D vector with G and you get the voltage distribution. And the inverse problem involves somehow trying to invert G so that given V, you will get D. Okay. So, so now we will see examples of how it is done uh, using various ways uh, today. Okay, so let's get started on that. So there are two sort of approaches that are used as far as finding the dipoles are concerned. First is that you think of only a few dipoles that are in the brain, whose location and magnitude and direction, they're all unknowns. Okay, and you try to find the correct, well, there's no correct answer per se. You just try to find uh, certain dipoles and their locations and their directions and magnitudes so that the model potential shown here matches the observed potential. That's one approach. The other one is where you say that I'm going to have a dipole at pre-specified locations all over the brain, like shown here in red dots. There are a ton of dipoles here, thousands of dipoles. And in this case, you could actually pre-compute the gain field matrix, because essentially what you're doing is placing a unit dipole at each location, and then based on your head model and electrode location, you can find out by solving these Neumann boundary conditions, you can actually find out what the contribution of that dipole is going to be on different locations on the head. Okay, so you create a head model, which is either a single sphere or concentric spheres or boundary element method, finite element method, and so on. You create a source model, which tells you where the sources are located. So here, these dots, for example, form a source model. You're saying that I've got, 10,000 dipoles separated by this much distance and located at these locations and so on. And you also provide where the electrode locations are. And together, head, source, and electrode locations, this will allow you to compute the gain field matrix. You already have this matrix in this non-parametric or distributed model. Okay, and then we will discuss ways to get D given B now. Okay, so as an example of this, this is what you could run if you have run this source localization program that's provided in the resource EEG resources. You start with the EEG MRI data, and you parcelate different segments there. So now you have the brain, the cerebrospinal fluid, the bone, and the scalp, and you assign, you assume that they have some fixed conductivities, and then you parcelate each of these segments into meshes. So these you can see in these faint triangles. So there are three different layers now, and these electrode locations, these dots are also provided to you. And this is the source model. This is where you assume that the dipoles are, these open circles are the dipoles. Okay, so now you've got a source model, a head model, electrode locations, and you can actually compute now the gain field matrix, this matrix G, based on all of this. And now let's talk about how to get the sources given the voltage distribution. Okay, so that's a classic source localization problem. There are a lot of different techniques that are used, and we will briefly touch upon some of them. Okay, so always remember that this is an ill-posed question. You only need to have knowledge of voltage at 64 locations, for example. But you're trying to estimate potentially thousands of dipoles. So there are lots of ways you could answer the question. It's an ill-posed problem because there are millions of, infinite number of source distributions that will give you the same sensor voltage distribution. So there's no correct answer. All of these methods essentially use different assumptions that we'll quickly talk about. And to arrive at a particular solution. Okay, so let's start with a parametric model. We won't spend much time on this. Basically, what you do is you fix the number of sources. Say I'm going to have p dipoles, let's say 3 or 4 dipoles, and you have to use some nonlinear estimation algorithm to minimize the error between what you see, the actual data, and that you have here, and what your estimate is once you put the dipole of a particular uh, direction and magnitude in the brain, and then do a forward model to estimate what the voltage is going to be given this dipole. Okay, so apart from P, location and direction and magnitude are also free parameters that need to be estimated. Turns out often the direction is more important than the magnitude. So here, for example, if you put one dipole, so it's just one dipole that you're looking at from 3 different angles. If it's pointing up, the voltage distribution on the scalp, now looking from the top here, this little thing is the nose, looks like this. But if you just, it's the same location, if you just change its direction, notice that the scalp distribution changes substantially. So just by moving this dipole around, you could actually change the scalp distribution considerably. Okay, typically you would here, for example, keep changing its location and its magnitude and its direction, and maybe put more than one, maybe 2 or 3 dipoles, and then try to get a model potential which matches the observed potential, and keep changing things here until the match is pretty good. Okay, that's it. It's a brute force approach. There are lots of issues with this approach. First of all, you need to know how many dipoles you want. It's a nonlinear problem because the gain field matrix will depend on the position of the dipoles. So it's not a fixed matrix. So essentially, you are changing both G as well as D and trying to get a product G times D that is close to V. Okay, getting back here. In this case, G is unknown and so is D. And you're trying to non-linearly just trying to estimate both such that the product matches or it comes close to V. Okay, and then lots of issues here that it depends on where you start from, what's your initial value of G and D. You might end up to a solution which may or may not be the global minimum. Okay, so there are ways to do this nonlinear optimization, but I won't talk about those methods. This is just to give a brief outline of how this sort of approach is followed. I'm going to actually spend more time on the non-parametric method, in which your number of dipoles are assumed to be much larger than the number of electrodes that you have at your disposal. Okay. So 1 second, let me set up the Wacom here. And there are lots of different approaches that are used depending on what your assumptions are. I'm just going to talk about one in more detail because they are all sort of related to each other mathematically, as we will see. Okay, so notice that now G is going to be fixed because you know where all these dipoles are. There are lots of know where each one is. All you need to know is where what the magnitude is. So this is whoops. Let me. So this is now going to be a 64 cross 1 matrix, assuming that you have got 64 sensors. And G is a very fat matrix now. Let's say 10,000. It could be any number. You decide how many dipoles you want. And then D is a tall matrix. It's going to be 10,000 cross 1. So you already know what G is because you can put a dipole at any location and then find out what the voltage is going to be for 64 electrodes. Right. So the problem now involves you have knowledge of V, you have knowledge of G. You just want to find out these 10,000 values so that when you multiply G with D, you get a voltage distribution that is very close to, to the actual V that you are seeing. Okay, but unfortunately, as you may see here, that it's a very highly underdetermined problem. If you think of these as free parameters, D1, D2, so these are like variables. So essentially, you have got 64 equations here. So each row is an equation. V1 is equal to, D1, this is D11, D12. So it's D11 as, I'll just call it G11. G11 multiplied by D1 plus G12 multiplied by D2. I'm just doing this multiplied by that plus that plus that and so on. So there are 10,000 entries here, 10,000 entries here. And this is one equation and you've got 64 such equations. Right. So obviously you will have find lots of D's, a combination of D's that will be able to give you the solution. So there's no fixed correct answer here. Lots of potential answers. So now what do we do? So let's first consider a case where there is no noise. So my problem statement is just this now. V is equal to GD. So I need to impose additional constraints now because otherwise it's just too unconstrained. So one good solution or one potentially interesting solution is to find a D which has the smallest norm. Now, what do I mean by norm? So when it comes to a vector, suppose this is a column vector, right? So D is D1, D2 to Dn. Its L2 norm is essentially root of D1 square plus D2 square plus Dn square. You could talk about its L1 norm also, L1 norm, which we'll see in a bit. And that is just mod of these. Okay. So I'm going to find a solution. So think of this that, whenever you are adding some putting some magnitude there, this total thing is some sort of like the total dipole energy. Right? So because L2 norm, when you square something and add, at least in signal processing terms, this is some sort of signal energy. So you can think of this as the total dipole energy. And let's try to find a solution so that this energy is minimized. This is called a minimum norm estimate. And I'm going to show you in the next slide that this solution is going to be given by this. Okay. Now notice that G is known, so I can actually pre-compute all of this. So I can pre-compute this so that whenever I now give you a voltage, a 64 cross 1 matrix, it will, this G is a 64 cross 10,000, all right? So G transpose is 10,000 cross 64. G transpose is 64 cross 64. So this whole thing, its inverse is also 64 cross 64. So this whole thing is actually a 10,000 cross 64 matrix. So whenever I give you a voltage input, a 64 cross 1 voltage vector, I'll get a dipole vector. I'll get the 10,000 dipoles that I started out with. This is the inverse. You have solved the inverse problem by doing this assumption that the minimum norm, the estimate, which means that this dipole has the smallest L2 norm. Okay, any questions on this?
Yeah, I have a doubt actually related to notation.
Yeah.
So this is one thing which I've struggled with actually in a lot of the linear algebra sections here, where we use this either single line or double line along around a vector. Does it mean anything special, or is it the same thing, especially with regards to L1 and L2 norm?
Yeah, well, so you would actually, so this is the mod, right? When it comes to just a number here, you would, uh, there are various ways to define it. This would be, for example, you could define the L2 norm like this. Some people, because L2 norm is the most popular one, would drop this, and then this becomes your, the natural L2 norm, because that's the most common one that is used. But typically you would put a number here to indicate which norm is this. When it becomes a matrix, then L1 norm actually means something else. It's then you take the sum mod of the each column and then find out which column has the largest L1 norm. So when it comes to matrix, it means something different. L2 norm always is the sum of the squares of all the entries that are there, whether it's a matrix or a vector. Okay, and then you take the square root. So ideally, you should put this and put a number here to indicate which norm is this. But if you don't, then it typically just means the L2 norm.
So does the modulus of a vector mean that every element of the vector's is converted to an absolute value? I'm a little confused there.
That's the L1 norm. This mod essentially just means is defined properly for a number. Otherwise, when it's a vector, you have to say what you mean by just taking the mod. So if you uh, so di to the power n sum and then 1 by n. This is the nth ln norm of a vector. Okay, so when n is set to 1, or you are looking at the L1 norm, it just turns to this. When n is set to 2, it becomes that, because when mod square is the same as square, they're both positive. So then it becomes this.
Okay, so when
But
I see lines near a vector, that should always imply that I'm dealing with a scalar value at the end of the.
that's right.
Okay.
Norm is always a scalar. It's some form of a distance.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I understood now. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So now let's find out why this is the minimum norm. This is the only part where I'm going to use some math. Um, but this is very, I think, intuitive and important to understand. So I'm going to explain why this thing is the minimum norm solution. So whatever I'm talking about right now is from this particular, uh, note that you have. In fact, this particular resource is very nice to even understand and brush up if you have done this stuff before. What you mean by a norm and in general linear algebra. So this I recommend if just going through the different chapters here, very small chapters but very intuitive, very well explained. So here's the logic. Now I've changed the notation. This is just like G is equal to dV, but now I'm going to write Y is equal to AX. So my aim is to find an X so that I solve this thing and X has the minimum norm. How do I go about doing this? So I make another assumption, which is that A has full rank, uh, which means that, remember A is a fat matrix, right? So it's an M cross N matrix. M here is 64 and N is 1000. Number of dipoles and number of 10,000 is what we were doing. So, what I'm saying here is that it has M linearly independent columns. Okay, so it has full rank. Row rank and column rank is the same for any matrix. Those of you who are familiar with linear algebra, it has the row and column rank of M. Okay, so what that means essentially is that if I do AA transpose, which now is going to be an M cross M matrix or a 64 cross 64 matrix, this is going to be invertible. None of its columns or rows are going to be dependent on each other. So I can actually do AA transpose inverse. Okay, so remember, so when I give you Y is equal to AX, if this was a square matrix, N cross N matrix, and it was invertible, my solution would have been trivially this. Sorry. But if it is not a square matrix, then it inverse doesn't have any meaning. You can only take inverse of a square matrix. So doing AA transpose converts it into a square matrix. And in this case, if it has full rank, then its inverse is always also there. So I can think of AX ln given by AA transpose inverse Y as one solution. Now, why is this one solution? Because AX ln is just AA transpose, right? So I've put this thing here. X ln is just this, but you can see AA transpose and AA transpose inverse will cancel each other out and you will be left with Y. So X ln given by this is a solution. Okay. But now I'm going to show that this is actually a solution which minimizes this. It is the minimum norm solution as well. Here I should specify that this is the L2 norm. So how do I solve that? So here's the solution. Suppose there's another X such that AX equal to Y. This is another solution. X ln is one solution, which is given by this. And suppose AX is another solution. Now, if this is the case, then A x minus x ln is 0 because AX is equal to Y. and ax ln is also equal to y. So ax minus ax ln is 0, which means that this thing here, x minus x ln, lies in the null space of A. So it is a vector which A takes to 0. Okay. And what you have to notice here is that this x minus x ln is actually orthogonal to x ln. Why so? So let's look at this. X minus x ln transpose x ln. So I'm trying to compute this. Orthogonal here basically just means that this vector transpose and this is actually 0. So how do I do that? So let's do this. X minus x ln transpose x ln. I put the value of x ln from here. So x minus x ln transpose, and this I have put the value x ln. But notice that I've got a transpose here and a transpose there. So I just put this together and write it as A x minus x ln whole transpose. But what is this? This is 0. So this is 0. That means x minus x ln happens to be orthogonal to x ln. Okay. And if this is the case, then the L2 norm of x, which is the same as this, I've just added x ln and subtracted that. And this now, 1 second. This now is just the sum of the individual norms because they are orthogonal to each other. It's like saying this is a plus b whole square and it's a square plus b square plus 2ab, but the cross, the third term is 0 because they're orthogonal to each other. So the norm of x is the sum of the norm of this and that, which is always going to be bigger than the norm of this. Therefore, x ln has to be the smallest norm for any solution x. Does that make sense? So I'll give you a graphical uh, way of looking at this, and then we'll get back and I'll then take questions because this might be confusing in the first go. So here's a graphical interpretation, which I think is very nice. So think of this as a high dimensional space in which the solutions x such that ax equal to y lie in this sort of space. It's shown as a line here, but you can think of this as a plane in a higher dimensional space. This includes each dot here is an x, right? So here x, this is my x as a vector in a high dimensional space, such that ax is equal to y. Okay, and this is the null space of A, which is the set of all x's such that ax is equal to 0. Notice that it passes through the origin, or 0 lies in this, because when x is equal to 0, then ax is also 0. So x equal to 0 trivially lies in the null space. Now what you have to see is that x ln is this thing. This is the projection of 0 on the solution set given by x equal to ax equal to y. This is the smallest distance between 0 here and this. So xln is this vector. Now, if I look at any other vector, let's say x. Okay, so this is that x value, and this was my x minus xln. Notice that this x minus xln now lies in the null space of A. That's this thing here. X minus xln lies in the null space of A, and xln, this vector, is orthogonal to x minus xln. So all I'm saying is that if I look at all the solutions here, this thing is the shortest. Everything else is bigger than this. So this is the minimum norm solution. This is the one, this is the smallest vector. Every other vector is bigger than this. Why? Because every other vector is just this square plus that square, and this is non-zero. So, this is going to be bigger. That's all is being done here. Okay, does that make sense? So I have shown that x minus xln lies in the null space of A. That's trivial. Then I show that this is orthogonal to xln, and therefore the norm of x is going to be the norm of xln plus some extra term. So it's always going to be bigger than xln. Xln, therefore, is the minimum norm solution. Okay.
Can you explain once that what are these parallel lines indicate? The line passing through the origin is the null space, and what is the above one?
That's the solution space. That's all set of all x's so that ax equal to y.
Okay.
Okay, so every point on this is a solution of your ax plus y, ax equal to y. There are infinite number of x's for which ax will be equal to y, but xln is this particular value here, which has the smallest norm, which is the shortest solution. Okay.
Yes.
Does that make sense? So I have shown you. Yeah. Any questions on this? So
Yes, sir. How can you just say once? How do we know that the least norm x is perpendicular to the null space?
yeah, that's done here. That's done here. It's perpendicular to xln. Perpendicular to xln. So this is the part x minus xln, which is so if I take any x here, so this part is x minus xln. This lies in the null space because a of x minus xln is 0, because ax equal to y and axln is also equal to y. Right? So x minus xln lies in the null space, and it happens to be orthogonal to xln. That is shown here.
Right. In the next page,
Yeah.
next slide, this orthogonality condition, like I'm asking about that one.
Yeah, so that's this.
Oh,
This thing
they're
is
the same
orthogonal
thing.
to that because, yeah, this transpose, this is 0.
Okay, okay.
Okay, and this comes about by putting this value and then looking at this, and this thing is 0. This part tells you that they are orthogonal because this x transpose y, this vector transpose that vector is 0. So these two vectors are orthogonal to each
Okay.
other. Okay.
Okay.
So see, I have found one solution now. And that's pretty cool. Now I have found one solution, and this can all be pre-computed. So now if I give you a voltage vector, you can find out a dipole vector. Now turns out this is one solution, but it may not be a good solution. Why so? Well, first of all, there is no biophysical reason why the solution should have minimum norm. I'm just saying that, hey, I'll find a bunch of dipoles such that the square of those dipoles, when you add them up, should be the lowest possible number. But biophysically, that doesn't seem to have a case. It seem to be the, there's no reason why that should be the case. Now, a bigger reason problem is that deeper sources will get penalized. So in your brain, so well, here's the brain. If the source is deep, then on the scalp, the contribution is going to be smaller. Now, if you want to minimize the energy of the dipoles, you will never put a dipole that's very deep because its contribution is smaller. So deeper sources will get penalized in favor of superficial sources. You will always find a solution in which the dipoles are very superficial because their contribution is larger, so that these dipoles can be smaller. So that is why you often pre-multiply the your dipole vector with some matrix W, which sort of adjusts this discrepancy. Okay, so it actually penalizes the superficial ones for being superficial, so that now the deeper ones also have a fighting chance against them. And this is called a weighted minimum norm solution. Now, how you're going to weight will depend on biophysics and all of other things. But essentially, the logic is now, instead of trying to minimize a D, you minimize WD. Okay, and then you can put some other constraints on W and try to do that minimization. This is called a weighted minimum norm solution. Okay. So the logic is still going to be the same. Let me show you the math here in after one slide. But essentially, all these solutions have this sort of a form where you pre-multiply the dipole vector with something which tends to minimize, tends to sort of even out your playing field, and then you try to minimize that. And there are different sort of restrictions that you can put on W. So here's one idea. This is what is called Loretta, which is a very popular, algorithm in the field. There are variants of this called S Loretta or E Loretta as well. If you are interested, you could try one of these out. Could be your, project, grant proposal project as well. So the logic here is that in the brain, this is not on the scalp, in the brain, you rarely have a situation that, one part is very active and the neighbors are not active at all. That is because in the brain, when some information goes in one part, chances are quite high that they will activate nearby parts as well. So neighboring voxels usually show similar activity. This is because neighboring parts of the brain actually do similar things and get inputs from similar areas. So the source space, not the sensor space, the source map is actually usually very sort of diffuse. It won't have very sharp points. It's like very low resolution image in the source space. Okay, so that's why where this name comes from. So instead of minimizing the norm of D, I can actually choose to minimize the Laplacian of D. Because if it's very smooth, then the Laplacian is going to be small. Okay, so here I actually pre-multiply D with a matrix W, which is essentially a Laplacian operator. It's a matrix version of the Laplacian operator, and I try to minimize that. This is one example where I am choosing W in a particular way. Remember, I could choose W in a lot of different ways. There's no good solution. These are all assumptions that I am putting, which allow me to get to a particular type of solution. So Loretta assumes that your sources are very diffuse. When you apply Loretta, you will never have a case where there's a very sharp dipole sitting and there's nothing nearby, because then this thing has a very large Laplacian. Okay, so the sources are always sort of very diffuse. So when I do a Laplacian, I get small numbers everywhere, and that is what I try to minimize. And then Loretta, you sort of also, um, deep and superficial sources are given same opportunity by normalizing the columns of G as well, so that the superficial ones don't get an advantage over the deep ones. So we will see this in a formal way next, and then this will become clearer. So general formulation is as follows. Now, not going to solve any of these. They're actually pretty hard to solve, but I will show you what the solutions look like. This one reference, it's mathematically involved. You'll have to spend a lot of time and have a fairly good understanding of linear algebra to understand what is going on here. But this one reference gives you a good solution for all of these. So if you are interested in source localization, please read this up. I'm just going to sort of give you the solutions here without trying to work them out because of lack of time. So the general idea is this. Now I'm not going to look at the noise-free solution. I'm going to look at the noise with noise solution. So when there was no noise, I was just trying to find a solution for this, V equal to GD. I solved it for the minimum norm solution. That one I showed, minimum norm estimate. Other ones I'm not going to show. But here what I was doing was, I had put a constraint on D. In this case, my constraint was the L2 norm. So LD was the L2 norm of D. And then I was trying to minimize LD. Okay, LD in this case for MNE is just the L2 norm of D. Now, when I have a noise, when I assume that there is noise, then I'm not always going to look for a solution in which V is equal to GD. Why so? Because V could be a very noisy estimate of the real V. So if I try to find a GD product which is equal to this noisy version of V, it may not be a good solution because V is not noiseless, it has some noise. So maybe if I try to get close to V, but not exactly reach V, get close to V, I have a better estimate D, which is in some ways a better approximation than what you would get if you try to solve it completely. So remember, GD minus V is an estimate of the noise in the system. V minus GD is an estimate of the noise. So I could actually have a formulation like this, where this is the noise and this is that operator that I was trying to minimize. And now instead of just trying to minimize this, which I was doing when the noise was assumed to be 0, I try to find a solution which minimizes whole thing. Okay, where this alpha could tell you how much you care about this minimizing this other sort of penalty that I have versus the noise term. Okay, so this is what you do when you have assume that there is noise in the system. So this first term is an estimate of how much noise is there, and then you try to find a solution which minimizes this whole thing. Now turns out, if you try to work this out, so this is now regularized minimum norm solution. This is a solution for which I'm still using the minimum norm as the penalty here, the regularization. But I'm assuming that there is noise in the system. So the estimate now will become this. This is the solution. I'm not telling you what the solution is, how I got the solution. You'll have to refer to this to get to the solution. Notice that when alpha is set to 0, I get back to where I was before. G transpose inverse G transpose V, which, actually, well, that was not that. This is where I was. Remember my inverse V. This was the earlier minimum norm estimate. Now there is an additional term here. Turns out these two are actually comparable. They're the same, whether you compute it this way or that way. Again, I am not showing this, but this is now the effect of having a more generalized optimization in which you are trying to also optimize the noise, and you have this alpha term here. Okay. So I haven't solved this. I haven't shown you what the solution is. I'm just telling you that this is where you will find it. It is a hard solution. But the important thing is even this can be pre-computed. Here I is just a diagonal and vector. It's a P cross P identity matrix. Here this is an N cross N identity matrix. You could always compute it. Alpha is a value that you impose, and it will give you a matrix that you just have to multiply with V to get D. Okay.
Alpha
Yeah.
due to the noise solution.
Alpha is some assumption that you put, which tells you how much weight you want to give to the regularization here versus the noise there. Okay, so it is your choice. You could either do it this way, it's something that you would put based on some prior knowledge that you have about the sources. It just gives you a weightage that you apply to the constraint that you have. That's it.
Okay.
Okay. So in this formulation, the weighted minimum norm solution just becomes this. Again, I'm not showing you how it is done. You can refer to Grech et al. And you find the math, it's involved. But again, the point is that you have a weight vector that you now need to specify what this is going to be. This is not something that you will get as a solution. This you need to determine, like alpha, you need to determine this based on biophysics and other considerations, where how much weightage you should give to the deeper sources, for example, and so on. But once you have this, you could pre-compute the whole thing here, because G is known, W is known, alpha is known. You just pre-compute this, and then when I give you a voltage vector, you will get a estimate of the dipoles. Okay. And finally, when you get to Loretta, essentially it's the same formulation as before, but now you pre-multiply D with two vectors. One is this delta. It's a Laplacian operator, still a matrix. Actually, it will look something like this. It will have something like that. This thing will, in a matrix form, do this sort of a computation where you subtract off the neighbors. So you could make an operator as a matrix. Okay, and this will be for all the different locations. But you could actually have a Laplacian operator as a matrix, and then this is a diagonal matrix which normalizes the column of G. So you have pre-multiplied this D with two of these, and then you try to find the solution here, and the Loretta solution is given by this. Again, you know what this is and that are, these two are known. So actually you can solve this whole thing upfront. Before you start doing the source localization, you could pre-compute this. Once you have the lead field matrix, you can find B, because that's just a diagonal matrix that it does column normalization, and you know this. This is the Laplacian operator in matrix form. So you can pre-compute this and you're done. Okay. And again, so you have to take my word for it for these things, because I'm not solving any of these. The solutions are hard. You need a fair bit of linear algebra. But again, think of this as a solution that can be given to you once you know what G is. Okay, and all of these were for solutions when we assumed that this dipoles are all independent of each other. But in general, the dipoles are not independent of each other, right? If you have got a dipole here and the nearby one, there might be some correlations between the two. The magnitudes might be correlated, because after all, if they are near your brain, close in brain space, their activity might be correlated. So there is a way you could actually bring in uh, the correlations between noise in the electrodes as well as dipoles. So you could have a more sort of generalized solution in which you assume that the noise vector, this is noise now in the sensor space, it's a 64 cross 1 vector. They are not independent but have a particular covariance matrix, which is given by C here. And likewise, your dipoles also have a particular covariance matrix given by R. And then the minimum norm solution turns into this. Okay, and again, I'm not proving this, but to take my word for it, this is how you would get the minimum norm solution after even incorporating correlations between the noise in the sensor space and also between the dipoles. Okay, so these are different forms of solutions, but note that they can all be pre-computed based on the assumptions that you have put in. Okay, so I'm out of time for today, so we will continue with this, and I'm going to talk about beamformers quickly, and then we will wrap up in the next two classes, the remaining part. Okay, so I'll stop now and take questions.
What is exactly column normalization?
Well, you're normalizing, the columns so that they have the same norm. Each column has the same L2 norm. So,
Okay.
that's it.
So we set the normal, like is norm is equals to 1, and each of the column of G should have the same norm.
That's right. That's right. So you think of G as lots of column vectors, right?
Mm-hmm.
So these are column vectors. So if this is 64 cross 10,000, right? And so each dipole here, this is 10,000 cross 1. So you can think of this as an operation where each of these columns corresponds to a particular dipole. And you just want to make sure that the dipoles that are very deep. So if a dipole is very deep, that column will have very small values, because that the contribution of that dipole on the surface is going to be small. So you just want to make sure that they get normalized so that each column now has the same weight. So that column normalization is done by this matrix B. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, just you guys have to read this actually. I mean, what I'm saying today is a very sort of brief overview of source localization, which is a very involved topic. I mean, you could actually have a course on just source localization. So I encourage you guys to just spend some time and reading this up.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Actually, it's about like the believability of how this math actually works, like in real experimental settings. Has this been tested with like side by side, probably on patients with epilepsy or something, with depth electrodes to make sure that what the results that are coming are actually local, and or like that, is there any evidence
Yeah,
this
yeah.
method?
So that's right. So although there is no unique solution, there are solutions that based on physiology. Like for example, as you were saying, epilepsy, or from fMRI, for example, you will know that okay, V1 should be activated if it's a visual stimulus, and then you look at your solution and check whether the solution is localized to V1 or not. Things like that, and people have been doing this forever. Nobody would give any credibility to any of these were they not sort of reasonably good, giving good estimate of where the true sources are. Now, fewer people would have done both, where you actually look at the recordings in the sensor space using, let's say, EEG type recordings, as well as source space using microelectrodes. So we have a setting in our lab, for example, where we record simultaneously from microelectrodes and EEG. So we could actually check this a little bit better. Those become very hard experiments in general. But based on physiology, you will have a fair idea where the sources are. I'll just give you the solution here. This is what we get as the gamma source. We will see this in the next class. So gamma source is nicely localized to about V1 or the visual areas which we think are generating gamma based on our LFP recordings. So this is done on our data. So you can see that it seems to be a good solution, but there's no true way of verifying this unless you actually record from the entire brain invasively while doing these recordings, and that's just a very difficult question. Okay.
Yeah. I won't be surprised if someone has tried some deep learning or something to try and like link this kind of results with like the LFP and the more focal kind of the more.
Yeah. So, there's no deep learning. The one that I know of is by a guy called Jeff Scholl, who, so it becomes very complicated because you're recording from invasively, you put a lot of metal implants inside the brain, and that changes the field. So what you see in the scalp domain in the sensor space is now the actual sources, but they are also modified because you have a metal plate and meshes and those things. So this Jeff Scholl's model actually tries to account for that also. We have also tried this a little bit, or at least we were thinking about trying this, because we have a recording setup in our lab which is well suited to do this. We record from a microelectrode array, and then we record from EEG as well. So you could ask, if I source localize the EEG data onto that little part where I'm recording from using microelectrodes, how good is the match? But then because there's a microelectrode implant and some ECOG electrodes also, they actually distort the field. So you have to account for that also. Not to mention a lot of small plates that we need to put to secure the bone back on the electrode array and all that. So it becomes a very difficult question. But if somebody is interested, it's an excellent thesis question actually. Something that we are in a very good position to um, address, because we record from multiple source locations at the same time. So it's a good thesis question that somebody can pick up. Okay. All right, folks. So only 2 more classes. We'll finish off by Friday. Okay, so make your choose your partners and let me know by email who your partner is. Me and Krishna Kumar and Onkon. And